Years ago, back in the 1980s, there was an Israeli song that began with the words, Kol Shana Matchila B'Siman She'ela. Every year begins with a question mark. Now, there's nothing earth-shattering about that insight. Obviously, we begin the new year with a question mark and an inherent uncertainty about the future. The very image of the book of life, written on Rosh Hashanah and sealed on Yom Kippur, affirms our preoccupation at this time with uncertainty about what the coming year will bring. The Talmud teaches, Kol hatchalot kashot, all beginnings are hard, and beginnings often fill us with uncertainty. And that is probably what the writer of this Israeli pop song had in mind in the 1980s. Speaking of uncertainty, our plan actually was for Cantor Barbara to sing the song because it's a really catchy tune. I'll send it to you in a YouTube so you'll be able to enjoy it. And I want to explain to you what I'm really thinking about this morning. With uncertainty, we often have to figure out how to respond. And our president, Michelle Anfang, has encouraged me to use the word nimble. Throughout her presidency, she said, we need to be nimble, which of course she's right. But what I wanted to do this morning is I wanted to put a little bit of meat on that idea. And I wanted to think about what Jewish wisdom might offer us and how we navigate uncertainty. Nimble is the word, but I want us to be thinking about it, and I actually couldn't have planned it better had I tried. Cantor has a cold. She doesn't sound like herself at all. As of Friday, we were down a custodian. We, your temple staff, needed to be nimble, and we really needed to think about how we respond to curveballs or uncertainties. And so with that in mind, I want to share some ideas with you. The truth is, people have always lived with uncertainty, from illness and disease to snow days, plane cancellations, corporate mergers, or closings. The idea of changes and uncertainties brought about by the last 2 years have shown us, however, just how much we've taken for granted and how many of us naively relied on what we thought was the certainty in our lives. The reality of COVID, the disease, the varying responses, and far-flung impacts reminded us all that so much is unknown. A concept I suspect our ancestors, even just a few generations ago, understood intimately. After all, you know the Yiddish expression, man plans and God laughs. With the metaphoric book of life open before us and before God, we'll explore what wisdom Judaism might offer us about navigating uncertainty. A colleague of mine in London, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, has noted that the Jewish tradition we actually begin our new year with not just one question mark, but multiple. First, he notes that with just a little bit of imagination, the shofar, the instrument of Rosh Hashanah, actually looks like a question mark. And then he says, the shofar differs from almost every other musical instrument. Strike a key of the piano or pluck a string of the cello, and you know pretty well what sound is going to come out. But even for the very best shofar blower, there is at least a little bit of uncertainty. Pianos, guitars, cellos, trumpets are all made to careful technical speculations, while the shofar retains the wildness and unpredictability of its natural materials, and thus of nature and reality. It is that unpredictability and naturalness that makes the shofar quite a good metaphor for a new year that is naturally filled with unpredictability. When we look on the past, we know, as is often said, the one thing that is constant is change. Inevitably, in 5783, we'll be spending a lot of time juggling uncertainties, making decisions with insufficient information, and adjusting to altered and necessitated realities. In fact, we're already doing that now. As we sit here with the last foot barely out of 5782 and our first foot barely in 5783, we also may feel like we're standing in a doorway between worlds and even lifetimes. And while I hate to date things around the pandemic, think about how far we've come since Rosh Hashanah 2020. Changing realities, vaccines, increased immunity based on exposure and acceptance have certainly enabled us to move on from how we responded 2 years ago. Many of you are here in our Cantor Morton James Sanctuary, which was unavailable to you 2 years ago. And at the same time, because of the changes we made and the reality of COVID concerns, many of you can join us from home. Regardless of where you are, here we are, in this moment, this space of uncertainty together. And this space and time is one of both confidence tinged with humility. What do I mean? Are not these two things contradictory? So my first piece of wisdom from our tradition has to do with having confidence in decision-making and humility at the same time. Confidence in decision-making and humility are not opposites. In fact, they need to work together. In order to move into 5783, we have to work with confidence that things will happen, things we planned for, and things that we did not. Moses Maimonides teaches that a righteous person is someone who does not waffle when making a decision. The tzaddik can be trusted, amar alav lav ve'al kain kain. When that person says no, it's a real no. And when that person says yes, it's a real yes. Indeed, for Maimonides, who is thinking as a Jewish legalist making a decision, yes has to mean yes, and no has to mean no. Though he might have been thinking as a physician or as a father or as a community member or as a businessman, there are countless moments in life that necessitate definite, clear, undisputed answers. But I have to imagine that Maimonides had the humility to know that today's yes or today's no may or may not always be applicable or suitable. And Maimonides knew from uncertainty, as he lost his brother and his family's wealth in a storm at sea, which understandably drove the Rambam into a deep depression and acceptance of uncertainty. I said that I wanted to see how Jewish wisdom might help us manage uncertainty, and my first point was that decision-making and humility are not mutually exclusive, and as a result, we have to accept others' decisions, even if we might make a different decision. For example, some of us are not ready to be inside with hundreds of unmasked people. Some of us are fine to be inside with hundreds of unmasked people. Some of us wear a mask when we go into the big Y, others do not. And while I illustrate my point using COVID, the issue extends far beyond. Some of us are afraid to fly and would only take a driving vacation, not because of COVID, but because they're afraid of airplanes. Some of us, when there's a threat of a snowstorm, we stay home. As we make decisions, I urge us to remember we make decisions for ourselves, and we allow space for others to make decisions for themselves, not judging them, not disparaging them, but recognizing they have their issues that they're managing, and we have ours. That's my first point. My second point of how we manage uncertainty in making decisions actually comes from Pirkei Avot. Hillel the elder presented two apparently contradictory teachings, one right after the other. Imein ani li mili, uchsha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I'm not for myself, who will be? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? In other words, when making a decision, we should prioritize our own needs. But our tradition teaches we should not only prioritize our own needs. Indeed, Pirkei Avot is teaching that when prioritizing self over community, there must be space to consider what kind of self you are in that moment. The teaching continues, if not now, when? We have to make decisions. We can't vacillate and debate and wonder and examine for forever. At some point, we need to decide. So I've spoken about humility and decision-making and about the needs to negotiate the individual and the community. The final example of how Jewish tradition guides us during times of uncertainty comes from the story of the Israelites wandering in the desert. I find it helpful to note that our ancestors' feelings about uncertainty made up a good percentage of the contents of the Torah. 4/5 of the Torah take place in a span of just 40 years. While the book of Genesis covers from creation to our arrival in Egypt, the remaining 4 books cover our exodus from Egypt to our arrival into the shores of the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land. And while those 4 books cover the 40 years of wandering in the desert, nearly 39 of those 40 years are not mentioned at all. That's right, 4 books for roughly 18 months of recorded life. And when you take out the commandments, of which nearly all 613 are there, most of the remaining chapters describe the people of Israel in their typical mode: complaint, disagreement, dispute, disappointment. Complaint, disagreement, dispute, disappointment. I could go on with that. While we usually explain away the Israelites complaining to their general immaturity and obnoxiousness, there is an approach which is to see the Israelites complaining as a symptom of their anxiety at being in a time of transition, a symptom of their anxiety at dealing with uncertainty. They've left behind the oppression of slavery, which, while obviously unpleasant, was at least predictable. Suddenly, they're thrust into the freedom of the desert. You would think they'd be overjoyed, and yet they do sing songs of victory, but very quickly they revert to complaining. And on several occasions, I'll remind you, they actually speak wistfully of the good old days in Egypt. On a few occasions, they even turn around and want to head back. Perhaps the simplest explanation for our ancestors' behavior is that they craved certainty and stability, just as often we do. They complained when they didn't have that stability. Our ancestors knew they were leaving a time of stability, and eventually a new time would emerge. But the current form, the journey, the transition, that was really uncomfortable. And so what could they do but complain? The reality is, transitions are difficult, even in the best of circumstances. Anthropologists use a particular term to refer to moments of transition. They call these liminal moments, following the Latin word for doorway. These are times in our lives when we find ourselves walking through a doorway without a clear sense of what will greet us on the other side. Such liminal moments hold promise and excitement for new possibilities, but necessarily and actually inherently, they are times of uncertainty. They are times when we leave behind that which we knew. And for many of us, that makes us anxious. Probably everyone in this sanctuary has been in a liminal moment. When a spouse dies and we are forced to recreate our lives. When we become an empty nester and we are challenged to create new routines. When young adults graduate college, there's a huge transition as these young adults need to create routines and establish a new kind of living. When we move from one home to another, from one state to another. When we change jobs, when we get divorced. When someone retires, they are leaving one reality and are challenged to find new structures, new routines, new ways of living. To live life is to have known liminal moments. The Jewish life cycles mark those moments as well. The liminal moments are difficult, but they can actually be times for maximal creativity and growth. Certainly that's true of the 40 years of wandering in the desert, which was a time when our ancestors became forged as a people. And so often our most valuable achievements, our most valuable insights take place at these critical junctures of uncertainty. And I want to pause and think about our community for a moment and think about the uncertainty we have navigated. Anthropologists talk about creativity and growth. I believe that's what we've experienced as a congregation in the last few years. I know we've struggled, and I know it's been hard, but we've also grown. And I want to get very specific to this last weekend when we found ourselves without a custodian on Friday at 3 o'clock. And Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, there were lots of volunteers here to ensure that our building was ready and that we would be ready. Creativity and growth. There was probably some anxiety. I didn't see too much obnoxiousness, but who knows, maybe there was. It's hard. Our challenge when we are faced with moments of uncertainty, when there is a question mark, our challenge is to bring our best selves forward and to be humble and yet to make a decision, to think about ourselves and yet to think about the community, and to understand that in this moment of uncertainty, in this liminal moment of transition, there is an opportunity for growth if we open our heart, if we keep our ears open to the possibility, if we allow ourselves to grow, then perhaps we will. With the setting sun last night, 5782 closed. With the setting sun last night, 5783 open. With the creation, God created evening first according to the rabbis. When one day ends, there is darkness and uncertainty, but as the day unfolds and develops, light grows in the morning. There is darkness and uncertainty, but there will be light and definition. Our year begins with a question mark, and even an instrument shaped like one, as every year does. As we pray for the best possible outcomes for our family and friends and community, in our nation and our world, we also note that we're standing in a doorway from year to year, from one way of being in the world to another that is unknown. We ask God and each other to be patient with us, to recognize and soothe our discomfort, to guide us to make wise decisions, even without all the information we would like, and to help us fully appreciate this transitional moment and approach it with creativity that the moment demands and deserves. And the song says, Kol shana matchila besiman she'elah. Every year begins with a question mark. And the chorus is, Va'anachnu nimsa lo tshuva. And we will find in this year an answer. Shana Tova. So I hope when you came to services this morning, you all got this ekru handout, and that you can easily pull it out. Craig Kazin is here to share with you. By now, you know my theme for the holidays is listening. And what I want to do this morning is tell you a few stories and look at a few texts from the Torah and Haftarah reading is examples of not such good listening. But first I want to tell you a story about the Hebrew and Yiddish writer and Zionist leader Shmirayahu Levin. The truth of the matter is I thought that was just a street in Jerusalem. I didn't realize it was a person until, 10, 15 years ago. But he would tell a transformative incident that took place when he was about 10 years old. It happened in Eastern Europe. He received a gift of his very own shofar. And as Rosh Hashanah approached, he was so excited to practice sounding the shofar. But he tried really hard, and I could so relate to this poor child. During the whole month of Elul, he tried practicing his shofar. He would spend at least an hour a day holding it in various positions, trying to get a little sound out of the shofar. And he failed miserably. Sometime, if you're lucky, I could show you what that looks like. The day before Rosh Hashanah, as he was practicing outside his home, a Russian farmer came by and said, "Hey, what's that?" And so he took it and he explained it to the farmer. And the farmer said, "Can I try?" And he took the shofar and he held it up to his lips. And out came the best and the longest Tekiah Gedolah that poor little Shmirayahu Levin would ever hear. And he raced back to his teacher and he was choking back the tears and he said, "It's not fair. I spent the whole month trying to sound the shofar. And in comes the peasant farmer and he gets it the first time. He gets a beautiful sound." And his teacher reassured him and said, "The blessing that the person who sounds the shofar says before blowing the shofar is Lishmoa Kol Shofar. Blessed are you, God, for listening to the sound of the shofar." So even the shofar blower, even those folks, the mitzvah isn't about blowing the shofar, it's about hearing and listening. The trick isn't how to sound the shofar, although Steve, wherever you are, you did a fantastic job. The trick is listening. I love that story, maybe because I could just so relate to trying and just not being able to get it right. But I love that image and being told it's not the sound you get out, it's the listening that counts. And so I thought about that, and I thought about this holiday, High Holy Days in general, as being what I called in my computer listening boot camp. So for the last chunk of time, I've been looking for texts and stories about listening and hearing and paying close attention. And I put together a bunch of them here, and what I want us to do is look through the text. And the first text I want us to look at is actually so obvious, I don't mean to insult you that I used it. But there are many different ways to interpret the text, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The obvious one, which is the way we're taught, and which is the way I teach in the preschool, is I say Shema Yisrael means we Jews, we have one God. But the truth is there's another way to look at this line, and that is to say that there's a commandment, Shema Yisrael, and we're all Yisrael, and what's the commandment? The commandment is to listen or to pay attention. So I want to put it out there, those of you who come to our minyan, when you say the Shema, yes, it's about one God, but perhaps another way to say it is that it is about listening. My colleague, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, who is noteworthy on her own, is also the first woman to be ordained as a conservative rabbi. And today she wrote a book in which she talks about conflict resolution, and she shared an interpretation of the second paragraph of the Shema that I want to share with you. So the second paragraph of the Shema, it's on your sheet, it's number 2, and it says, if you obey the commandments, then life is going to be good. And it says, and I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains. And it goes on to talk about how life could be good. But the text goes on and says in verse 16 Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods, and God's anger will burn against you. So the second paragraph of the Shema talks about being rewarded for being obedient and being punished for disobeying God. So my colleague, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, who does this work on conflict resolution, offers a really interesting perspective on this text because she, like so many of us, struggles with this idea of reward and punishment from God. So she was doing a workshop with some 20 people or so, and she asked people to recall a time that they felt like they had been heard, that they felt like they had been listened to deeply. And she asked that people, how did you feel when you felt as though somebody heard you? And she said the response was loved, whole, at peace, good. So then Rabbi Eilberg asked the opposite question, and she said, so what did you feel like when you wanted to be heard, but you weren't? And she says that the differences were stark. Some participants talked about ignoring a child's need for attention, and soon thereafter there would be a temper tantrum, or how distracted or self-centered listening with an intimate partner evoked a storm of negative emotion. And all this leads Rabbi Eilberg to this really interesting reframing of the second paragraph of the Shema. My whole life until this summer, I read the second paragraph of the Shema and thought of it as reward and punishment for obedience to God. So she says, no. It's not true in meteorological terms. The puzzling passage predicted the dire consequences of poor listening. Relationally speaking, this is a description of life as it is. In other words, when it says, V'haya'im shamoa, if you listen, she says, when you listen, you feel whole and loved, and the people around you feel whole and loved, because you're modeling and you create a community of listeners. And she said, but when you don't listen, there are dire consequences. Not just for you, but for the people around you. So I thought that this was really an interesting way, and I wanted to share with you, Rabbi Eilberg doesn't just talk Torah and write Torah, she lives it. So I want to tell you what happened with Rabbi Eilberg and me. She and I are on many listservs together, but this was a listserv in which I wrote something that she didn't agree with. I won't bore you with the details of what it was about, but she wrote a response and it stung. I felt a dagger in my heart. And I wanted to write back and say, are you kidding me? But luckily I had some place to go, and so I just walked away from the computer. And by the time I got to my email, there was a note from Rabbi Eilberg in which she said, I feel like maybe I'd love to talk to you. I'm afraid my last email, which was to a listserv of people, could have been hurtful. Can we talk? So this happened like 3 days before we were getting married. So I said, do you mind waiting until after the wedding? I just want to focus. She was all happy, of course. So in the middle of January, we finally had a Zoom conversation. And she asked me what I was thinking and what was on my mind and what propelled me to write what I wrote. And I explained it, and she listened. And I listened to her. And I felt good. When we hung up, she still believed what she believed. And I still believed what I believed. But I was seen and heard, and that felt okay. I could live with that. And so I was taken. It was after that conversation that I went and got Rabbi Eilberg's book, because I thought, this is a woman that walks the walk and doesn't just talk the talk. So what I want to do now is look through 3 or 4 more passages that we've read already, but I want to use them as examples of not such great behavior and one great example of wonderful behavior. So in our Haftarah this morning, I'm on the second page. It says source 3. I want to remind you about this man. His name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. And Peninnah had children, and Hannah didn't. And the text says that Hannah couldn't stand it, that she was really struggling. The infertility was really hard for her. She really wanted to be a mom. At the bottom of the page, I want you to read what Elkanah says. Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downtrodden? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? What's the matter with those questions? Are they questions of curiosity? I don't think so. He's actually scolding her. Aren't I better than 10 sons? He's giving her a pep talk. What are you getting so upset about? What's the terrible? I don't need you to have children. I just love you. But then, first of all, that's not what he says. And secondly, he doesn't act in an empathetic way, in that he doesn't even allow Hannah to be in pain. It's actually a very bad example. Even though I want to say I believe that Elkanah went to Hannah with love and that he cared. But he wasn't really listening to her. And there's an arrogance there, like, aren't I better to you than 10 sons? She wants to be a mother. Being a mother is not the same as being a wife. And so it's not possible that that exchange was a positive one. Poor Hannah had a rough day. And what I mean by that is not only did her husband not hear her, she goes to shul. And what happens in this instance is the priest at the time has these preconceived notions. Eli sees her, and instead of seeing her and being curious, what does he do? He sees this woman, and he thinks she's drunk. She's praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not. And Eli thought she was drunk, and he says to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Really? Can you imagine coming to shul and being so desperate and having, now I'm going to say, the rabbi rebuke you and accuse you? Like, it's terrible. If the first example was an example of listening in which it was scolding, in which it was insufficient, and it didn't come from curiosity, the second example that our Haftarah offers us is an example where you make these assumptions, and once you make the assumptions, then you can't listen. So if my colleague Amy Eilberg, Rabbi Eilberg, had made assumptions about me, she wouldn't have bothered to send an email. She would have dismissed me because, after all, she knew better. And she wouldn't have worried about our connection. Now, the truth is, I wanna redeem Eli. He goofed big time. But then when she says, no, I'm not drunk, I'm praying, he turns and says, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked for. But first he attacked her. And then he took a step back. And in that regard, I want to say that was my interaction with Rabbi Eilberg. She first put out, but then she walked her walk. And she said, no, I want to talk and I want to hear. The last 2 examples I want us to look at are on the back of the page. The back of page, it says page 4 on the bottom. So you could not listen sometimes because you're making assumptions. You could not listen sometimes because you're just not listening because you want to move someone to where you want them to be. But tragedy can prevent listening as well. And I want you to imagine for a moment what happens in our Torah reading. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar, and he set them on her shoulders, and he sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert. She ran out of water, and she was desperate. What did she do? She was so distraught. She didn't hold her son in focus. She went off and sat down about a bow shot away. She said, I can't watch this pain. I can't do it. And as she sat at the distance, she raised her voice and wept. Tragedy can sometimes make it impossible to listen. Okay. At least know that. At least know for yourself when you're in that place where it's so dark you can't listen. And maybe try. And be aware. And so these are all examples from our scriptural readings this week of bad listening this holiday. But then there's just my favorite, which comes, and of course it would be God who would model good listening. Because what happens is Hagar puts her son down, and she goes off, and she's crying at a distance. And the Torah text says, Vayishma Elohim et kol hanahar. God heard the cries of the child. And the most interesting line there is God says, Ba'asher husham. God heard the voice of the boy in the place where he is. And why is that such wonderful modeling? Because he was in the moment with the child. And what does that mean for us? Sometimes there are people who we don't like or who rub us the wrong way. Or we know their past, and we know that in the past they've done ... Ba'asher husham means be present for them in the moment. Yesterday, or 2 months ago, and 2 years ago, isn't what we're talking about. It's to be in the here and now. And yes, a grudge, for example, or a behavior that someone exhibited 3 years ago, if you want to listen to that person, be in the moment. And that's what God does. And by the way, remember Ishmael, he was he and his brother Abraham didn't always get along so well. But that's not what this moment was about. This moment was about a boy who was crying. This moment was about a boy who was thirsty and whose mother wasn't around. And God heard him. And God responded. So I wanted to look at many different instances from our text because I think they're illustrative of what we can be doing to listen more, to hear better, to respond more attentively. And I want to conclude by telling you just one last story, and this story is about Rabbi Jacobson, who I think most of you know. Rabbi Jacobson is, she's been here for forever. She lives in Amherst, but she's a chaplain at the JGS, and she's a very dear friend. The truth is, Rabbi Jacobson and I hardly agree on a thing. Like when we sit down together to talk, we shouldn't talk, on one level, we shouldn't talk about world issues because we're two sides of a coin. But what I love about talking with Rabbi Jacobson is she's genuinely curious to hear what I'm thinking and what guides my framing of the situation. When she asks me a question, she doesn't say, "What are you thinking?"
She says, I'm curious to know what brought you to that conclusion. And she listens first, and she wants to understand. And never is she trying to change my mind. She respects me. And she says, you are a cherished colleague, so if you believe this, if you see this way, I want to know what you're seeing, because I don't. I think that's why I love Rabbi Jacobson as I do, because I feel heard, I feel seen, I feel whole. I gave you 2 examples of colleagues of whom I've had different conversations. And I actually want to end with a prayer. My prayer is that I have a colleague in a synagogue somewhere who's telling a story about me. And they're saying, I don't know if it's true, I hope so. I'm hoping somebody is saying, that Rabbi Wallk, I never agree with her, but she wants to hear what I'm thinking. And I hope the people who I spend my life with know, and I hope I walk the walk the way Rabbi Eilberg and Rabbi Jacobson do. And what I really hope is that you'll join me on the walk as best you can. Shana Tova.
So I like to try and pick a theme for the year. And this year, the theme that I talked about was listening. We talked about uncertainty and making room to listen for others who navigate uncertainty differently than we do. And on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we looked at texts to talk about, to see models of actually very poor listening and lack of understanding. And then last night we had it was really extraordinary to hear somebody born and raised in China talk about what is it about Judaism that would take a woman who never met someone Jewish before she went to college to say, I want to be Jewish, and the path that she went on. So this morning, I'm sticking to the theme, but I'm getting there in an indirect way. I want to talk about Israel this year because Israel turns 75 this May. And really what I want us to do is to think about what we as American Jews are doing and how we're relating to Israel and how we're hearing criticism of Israel and how perhaps that's distracting us from the real point. But it's going to take me a while to get there, so just bear with me. My teacher, Rabbi Danny Gordis, recently wrote a column when he spoke about love and purpose as they relate to Israel. I wanted to invoke Gordis's wisdom about these 2 topics before telling you about a book I just finished, a must-read book for all of us. But before I get to Israel, I want to talk about love and nationhood, imperfection, and more. Most of us know love is hard. That's the bottom line. Although it is remarkable and romantic, wonderful and life-giving, to be and maintain and understand the deepest nature of love, we must get beyond roses and romance, the flowers and the poetic. Love, when defined with a deep sense of loyalty and obligation, connection and purpose, is really hard. With a spouse or a partner, with children and with parents. It's hard with our closest friends, and it's hard as people age and change and grow and adapt. Love is just hard. And that's why it's so problematic when we see Hollywood movies where everyone lives happily ever after, and it takes no effort. Movies, novels, television too often suggest that love is easy and effortless. But we know that just isn't the case, particularly when it comes to loving a country. I love America. In an era when we hear people talk about how imperfect America is, and therefore America is unlovable, they say, I have no qualms with saying loudly to anyone who will listen, I love America, knowing full well that America is not perfect. The problems in our society are way too long to enumerate, and besides, I imagine that all of you have your own list. Despite or in light of these lists, I don't give up on America, and I would never joke about giving up my citizenship. I am so grateful that my four grandparents were fortunate enough to arrive on the shores of this country. And I'm so grateful that my four grandparents were wise enough to realize their homes in Eastern Europe would never be hospitable to our people. And I'm so grateful my four grandparents were courageous enough and willing to sacrifice everything for future generations. There is no doubt my love of America comes from my four grandparents. For them, America was the promised land, literally the Golden Medina. And I am aware enough to know that while my family flourished, many others did not. I know that being white made my grandparents' adjustment in this country much more manageable. I know that America never was perfect, even though it became a welcome new home for Freeman, Grossman, Kunitz, and Wallk families. But if there were one thing I learned from the Jewish tradition, it's that perfection is completely unattainable. And so while I am proud and a patriotic American, I can simultaneously recognize that my family's experiences were not universal, and there's work yet to be done to build a more perfect union. Our tradition, our ancestors who formulated our heritage, understood that imperfection was inherent in life, and it filled our sacred texts and rituals with avenues to both see and express the reality of humanity and find ways to improve our character. Think of every biblical character, from Adam and Eve to Moses to David to Sarah to Hannah. We can look at each of these characters and find flaw and imperfection, and so too we can find model virtue and value. Look at the new year itself. The month of Elul, the period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the days of awe, or the Seret Yemei Teshuvah, the purpose of these days are to recognize when we've missed the mark and to find actions and ways to reflect and correct the course. So far I want to say love is hard. You can never love the perfect because the perfect is unattainable, and Judaism understands that imperfection is part of life. And that brings us to Israel. On a separate note, I hope that many of you will actually join us on a congregational trip to Israel. Later this morning, Craig and Nora Kazan are going to talk about the trip. But for now, I want to bring us to the idea of Israel. And I want to bring us to considering this concept of love and obligation, of imperfection and aspiration, in connection with Israel, which sadly for some in our American Jewish community is no longer worthy of their love. Recently, I was telling someone that Israel would be an important part of our service this morning. You may have noticed the beautiful photographs that are on display in our lobby. It's a traveling exhibit called Humans of Israel. We'll learn more about the artist and his work later this year, as the photographer will be joining us to talk about the project that he endeavored on as he took pictures of humans in Israel. Later, Craig and Norma will talk about our congregation's upcoming trip. And later this afternoon, my friend Rabbi Louis Warshauer will talk about what Israel means to him. I have placed Israel very much at the front and center of our holiday this year. Much to my disappointment, though sadly not my surprise, several of my colleagues and friends responded to me by saying, "Not at our synagogue." They claimed it was too risky, too divisive a topic. I recently learned about a synagogue here in the United States that has the name Zion in its name. The congregation is planning to change its name because the word Zion is too loaded politically. It's time to change the name to make the synagogue a little bit more appealing. The idea that a synagogue would take the name Zion out of its name is so anathema to Judaism and the Jewish people. It would be like our congregation deciding to rename our synagogue because the members no longer wanted the name of God, El, in the name of the synagogue because they didn't want to identify or be identified with God. I'm saying to you that Zion, Israel, is at the heart of what it means to be Jewish, like God is at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. There are many points I could raise about Israel today, but our time is limited, and I want to drill down onto one specific topic. So I want to tell you about a book that I recently finished. The book is an autobiography by the Israeli journalist Dani Adeno Abebe. It's a phenomenal book available on Amazon, and I highly recommend your reading. One thing about the author's name, he was born Adene Abebe, but when he got to Israel and they said, "What's your name?" Many of us know this story. He said Adeno, and they said, "Danny," right? Just like what happened to many of our grandparents, his name was Hebraicized. So the book was originally published in Hebrew. The name was Hamasa Lo Tam, The Journey Is Not Over. In English, the book is titled From Africa to Zion. His book is a highly personal memoir which offers a deep reflection on the challenges of his childhood from his village in Ethiopia through Sudan to the Jewish state. His story gripped me from the beginning when the author described his childhood in Ethiopia. While fascinating, I will just say the Ethiopia Abebe grew up in has been the same for centuries, millennia actually. Forget just a lack of electricity or plumbing. Rituals related to marriage, holidays, and family structure, Abebe literally called it prehistoric. Nonetheless, Abebe recalls with affection parts of his upbringing and life in the village. After describing his childhood, Abebe describes in detail the trek through the desert and the time in Sudan. And one of the things that I learned in reading the book is the very different experiences Ethiopian Jews who came to Israel had in 1984 during Operation Moses, as opposed to in 1991 with Operation Solomon. In 1984, they trekked through the desert and spent time in Sudan. And Abebe actually tells us that that experience was the Auschwitz of Ethiopian Jewry. He wasn't exaggerating. When you read the book, you'll hear the detail and the excruciating pain it took for his family to come to this country. He says that he believes that the Ethiopian Jews who arrived in Israel as part of Operation Solomon integrated more smoothly than those who arrived on his journey because the survivors of Operation Moses were traumatized and their wounds weren't healed. And as soon as they arrived, they were expected to be something else. Among the fascinating parts of the story to me, I learned that when the Jews left Ethiopia, their focus and direction was in going to Jerusalem. Abebe explains that his father never spoke about Israel, and neither did anyone in the community. They spoke solely about Jerusalem. They believed in Jerusalem. They believed one day a Messiah would come and bring them home to Jerusalem. And now, miraculously, it had happened. I cannot even imagine anything more miraculous, and neither could the Ethiopians. Was it the airplane and strangers welcoming them home, or to finally arrive in the Holy Land? In both cases, literally, the Ethiopian Jews had never seen anything like it before. In addition to the shock of encountering modernity as they did, there were unexpected hardships. Families were separated. A once tight-knit community had been traumatized on the journey. And despite the pain and the suffering, it was a moment of the ingathering of the exiles, of Kibbutz Galuyot, and it was a miracle. Here's what Danny Adeno Abebe wrote. And there I was, a little boy who had nothing in the world, no passport, no ID card, no father, no mother, no brothers. They had been separated along the way. He was alone on this airplane. But despite my fears and general confusion, the moment I stepped off that plane, after such horrors, was sweeter than honey. I felt that I knew where I was and where I had come from. As soon as we stepped on the soil of the land of Israel, we bowed down to kiss it. It was the most romantic kiss I have ever enjoyed, the sweetest kiss of all. After an exile of nearly 2,500 years, we were home. And this speaks to the purpose of the state of Israel, truly, an ingathering of the exiles. I once heard a BBC reporter say the following: I'm no fan of Israel, but there is no doubt about it. There is no government in the world that would fly its planes halfway around the world for a people of a different race, because those people said, we are your brothers and sisters. As we consider our love of Israel, we also have to remind ourselves of the purpose of the state. Israel has succeeded in establishing a Jewish homeland and has stepped forward to ensure an ingathering of our exiled people is possible. And yet, despite the successes, there have been many missed moments. While the ingathering was painful and the journey was horrific, the Ethiopian Jews were finally home, although their homecoming was challenging. You can imagine that if you believed that going to Jerusalem was part of a messianic ingathering, how much more difficult it was to go to a Jerusalem that can be harsh, to a Jerusalem that can be violent, to a Jerusalem that can be tense, to a Jerusalem where people can be rude and where racism is an obstacle to overcome. Just imagine taking someone who has not had their life changed for 3,000 years and introducing them to the modern world. Some of them knew Hebrew from their biblical studies, but modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew are not the same thing. Modern Israel and contemporary Ethiopia are not the same. Racism existed in Ethiopia, and racism existed and exists in the land of Israel. In Ethiopia, blacks actually based their racism on the color of skin. Abebe describes it in detail. In the land of Israel, as Israelis both created the miracle of Operation Moses and Solomon, they have also exhibited inexcusable prejudices against Ethiopians. The Ethiopian Jews who came to Israel struggled. The story is important to read because it's a story many of us don't know so well, and yet this is a story of our people. We should know and understand the Ethiopians' experience in Israel. Despite the challenges, despite how difficult it was, Abebe loves Israel. That, to me, is what is so fascinating about this book. From Africa to Zion describes how the Ethiopian community encountered racism and prejudices, as well as kindness and goodness. And Abebe never gave up on Israel, but devotes himself to making Israel the place he wants it to be. In 2017, Abebe, now married with children, went to South Africa as emissaries to the local Jewish community. He wrote the following, and I quote, "When we arrived in Johannesburg, we received a warm embrace from the local Jewish community. Walking around the city, I felt that I had three of the world's biggest problems on my shoulders. I was Jewish, I was Israeli, and I was Black. In South Africa, these three identities existed in permanent tension. For some of the Blacks, I was always Black, a foreigner whose children spoke a foreign tribal language. For the Jews, I was a temporary remedy to assuage their conscience. And for the anti-Israel activists, I was tantamount to an infiltrator persecuted by his own government. During Israeli Apartheid Week at Johannesburg's prestigious Wits University, organized by the anti-Israel boycott movement, I went there as an Israeli representative to try to represent a different perspective and to present myself as walking proof that there is no apartheid in Israel. Scores of students, the men bearded and the women veiled, stood there screaming that my natural home, the state of Israel, was an apartheid state. The look in their eyes revealed the intensity of their hatred for Israel, not against Israeli policy, Israeli government policy in the territories, but against the state of Israel as a historic homeland for the Jewish people. The Palestinians were not their concern. It was just an excuse. The shouting grew louder. I approached them and heard their chants. I, too, am a critic of Israeli policy on a range of issues, but this was a painful experience. I spotted a Black student with a big afro and big round glasses. He didn't look Muslim, but was wearing a Palestinian flag around his neck. He seemed like a nice guy, or that's what I thought. I went up to him and introduced myself. I told him, I'm from Israel. You're really from Israel, he asked, handing out anti-Israel propaganda leaflets as we spoke. I pulled out a scanned copy of my Israeli passport, which happened to be in my pocket, and I showed it to him. He looked surprised and even slightly embarrassed. What are you doing here? I told him I had come to listen, to observe, and to present the Israeli side of the story. I explained that in Israel there are no separate sidewalks for Jews and Arabs. There are no separate Jewish and Arab buses. There are no racially segregated services, and there was nothing like the "No Blacks, no Jews" signs that once blemished South Africa apartheid. The same was true of Blacks and whites. I told him that I was an example of a Black man living in Israel who had his share of problems, but was a free citizen. He was unconvinced. As far as he was concerned, I was part of the occupying apartheid regime on the side of evil. This is the dilemma that I think American Jews face today. We're having conversations with people who see Israel as evil, and somehow many American Jews don't have the language to respond. We don't have Danny Adeno Abebe's commitment and love for Israel, and we don't stand in his shoes, and that we haven't experienced the pain that he did. There's something powerful. What is especially powerful about this book is that he experienced prejudice, and yet he loves Israel. Our love for Israel, a fundamental Jewish value, Ahavat Zion, is being eroded today by American Jews who are unwilling to do so much as keep the word Zion in their synagogue's name because they've expected perfection and they've accepted a narrative by those who hate Israel and the Jewish people. Danny Adeno Abebe's story is so remarkably inspiring because he's lived and lives the challenges of Israel, and not once has he questioned his or his family's decision to make Aliyah. In this stunning book, he shares the complex, painful, and ultimately inspiring struggle he has experienced as he's fought for integration and acceptance. Rabbi confirms that the challenge to live as a full member of Israeli society continues 35 years later. The memoir shares many painful moments, such as the challenges his Israeli-born son faces as the only black child in his class. Rabbi recalls finding his son trying to straighten his hair and asking, "Daddy, why don't we look good?" This book is so important to me because of Abebe's disposition. He doesn't give up on Israel. He was raised with a true love of Zion, and that deep love allows him to criticize and demand better. And like Abebe, there is every reason in the world for you to be disappointed with Israel. From a lack of resolution with the Palestinians to environmental atrocities, from the power of the ultra-Orthodox to an education system that is broken and harmful, and the list could continue. But like Abebe, we do not have the luxury to say, "It's enough, I'm done." Love something so deeply flawed? Some might ask in response. Yes, I would say, because everything and everyone we love is imperfect. Our challenge is to give that gift of love generously to family, to friends, to our nation, because love is about loyalty and connection, commitment and obligation. And love takes work. And because nothing more is asked and nothing less. The late Israeli songwriter Naomi Shemer said it best: "Without the darkness, there is no light. Without the bitter, there is no ability to recognize the sweet." We accept the sting and the honey and pray for God to protect us as we continue to build and refine our homeland. I've asked Cantor Barber to conclude my remarks this morning with the singing of that song, Al Kol Elah, reminding us of the bitter and the sweet, and of our duty to find the love.
על הדבש ועל העוקץ, על המר והמותוק, על ביתנו עד נוגה שמואלי הטוב, על האש המבוערת, על המים הזכים, על האיש השב הביתה מן המרחקים. for the honey and the bee sting, for the bitter and the sweet, all the things that join as one to make our life complete. For the future of our children, our prayers will never cease. For the whole